Hey everyone, ready for a fascinating deep dive? Today we're exploring Nafsychology, something that blends ancient Islamic wisdom with modern psychology.
It's pretty amazing how this system uses centuries-old traditions,
Hmm?
to unlock insights into the nafs, that's the soul, heart, and intellect, and offers a new perspective on who we are.
Yeah, and our main source, The Art of Nafsychology, makes it clear that this is more than just another personality quiz.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's about, a real journey into our deepest selves.
Yeah.
One thing I found super interesting is this idea that psychology isn't like a brand new thing. It's rooted in these ancient philosophies.
Absolutely. For example, let's take the concept of the Ruh, the soul. Nafsychology describes it as the very essence of our being. It's our connection to something bigger than ourselves, almost like a thread from us to the divine. There's a beautiful story about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he describes the Ruh descending from the heavens, pure and innocent, before being kind of like enveloped by the layers of the self.
Wow, that's a really powerful image. So it's like our souls begin in this state of complete connection, and then, life happens and shapes us with all its experiences.
Exactly, and that's where the nafs comes in. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, like some might think.
Okay.
It's more like the sum of all our desires, our ego, those inner drives that can, sometimes lead us astray or towards fulfillment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So then how does the heart, fit into this? I mean, we usually think of the heart as like the center of emotions, but it seems like now psychology goes, a bit deeper.
Yeah, you're right. It goes beyond just pure emotions. It's more about, think of the qalb as this, almost like an intuitive compass within you, a source of wisdom that kind of gently guides us toward what really matters, and it influences our choices, shaping even our interactions with the world.
I'm really starting to see how connected all these elements are. The Ruh, with its connection to the divine, then the nafs with its, desires and drives, and the qalb, this guiding force inside us.
Exactly, and we can't forget about the aqwal, the intellect. Think of this as like the discerning mind. It's the part of us that analyzes, questions, and really searches for understanding. The aqwal helps us make sense of our experiences, guiding us to make choices that are aligned with our values.
It sounds like the art of Nafsychology really gives us this holistic view of the self, like acknowledging all these different parts of us and how they all work together. And it also digs into some really interesting concepts like 12 HLLs and qalb medicine. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Absolutely. That's where things get even more fascinating. These concepts add layers to how we see ourselves and our relationships. But before we get into those, let's maybe unpack the core principles of Nafsychology a bit further. Let's start with the different states of the nafs.
So we're really getting into Nafsychology now. And honestly, this whole idea of the nafs having these different states is kind of blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's a bit like, imagine your nafs on this spectrum, right?
Okay.
At one end, you've got the nafs al-amara. This is the part of us that's all about instant gratification, those like primal urges that we all feel sometimes.
Right. And that end of the spectrum, that doesn't sound like the most peaceful place to be honest. What happens as we move along this spectrum?
Well, as we start to become more aware of ourselves, we can start moving towards the nafs al-lawama. This is what they call the blaming self. It's that point where we begin reflecting on our actions. Maybe we experience some regret and we start trying to make better choices.
So it's like we're developing a conscience, right? Like becoming more conscious of how our actions actually affect things.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where real personal growth starts to happen.
Exactly. And as we keep going on this self-improvement journey, we head towards the Nas al-Muhammad. This is the inspired self.
Okay.
And this state, it's all about having this greater sense of purpose, intuition, even connection to, something bigger than ourselves.
I'm definitely sensing a theme here. This journey at the nafs, it's almost like it's about going from being totally focused inward to a place of greater connection and purpose,
Exactly. And the ultimate goal, it's to reach a state of nafs al-mutmainah. You could call it the tranquil self.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that sounds like total inner peace, true fulfillment. But how do we actually get there? I know the art of Nafsychology mentions something called qalb medicine. Is that connected to this at all?
Oh, 100%, yeah. Qalb metas are basically the different states that our hearts can go through, and they really influence how we see things, how we interact with others. So, for example, there's this thing called the seeker qalb meta. It's all about curiosity, this thirst for knowledge. And then there's the guardian qalb meta, and this one's focused on protecting loved ones, standing up for values.
So if we understand these qalb medicines, it can help us navigate relationships, understand why people see things so differently.
Absolutely. Imagine you're talking to someone, right, and they're in, say, a defender cult meta.
Yeah.
So they're feeling like they need to protect themselves or their beliefs. Now, because you recognize this, you can approach the situation with more empathy and understanding, and that leads to, much better communication overall.
That's such a practical example of how we can actually use this system in our everyday lives.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious now about those, you mentioned 12 HLALs earlier.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like Nafsychology's take on the whole 5 love languages idea?
You got it. You're right on track. But while the 5 love languages are really focused on how we give and receive love, the 12 HLALs go wider. They explore the whole spectrum of how our hearts communicate, how we connect with others. So for example, one HLAL is called takdir, and that centers around appreciation and validation. People who really need takdir, they feel most loved when their efforts are acknowledged, when they feel valued.
Right. That makes so much sense. We've all been there, right? Feeling unseen, unappreciated. If we understand these HLALs, it can be huge for our relationships. And not just romantic ones. I'm talking about work, friendships, everything.
Exactly. It all comes down to understanding those little nuances of how we communicate and connect on that heart level.
Okay, so we've covered the different states of the NAFs, the importance of called metas, and these fascinating HLALs. So we can see that Nafsychology gives us a lot of different concepts for understanding ourselves better. But what about the whole personality type thing? We hear so much about those 16 personality types. How does that fit into Nafsychology?
It's funny you should mention those 16 personality types because I actually took one of those quizzes, just the other day.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it made me think about how Nafsychology would approach this whole idea of personality. Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, the Art of Nafsychology talks about this directly. They have their own system. They call it TESNIF, which stands for the 16 cognitive types. So it definitely recognizes those cognitive patterns, how our brains process information, how we make decisions, but then it takes things a few steps further.
Okay, so it's not just about, are you introverted or extroverted?
Right, exactly. Nafsychology gets those basic preferences, but then it adds on these really cool concepts of Rue typology and Qualb typology.
Can you kind of break those down for us a little bit?
Sure. So Rue typology, this one dives into the soul's inclinations. You could think of it as those innate qualities that really drive us, our aspirations. It's actually inspired by the virtues of the 4 rightly guided caliphs in Islamic history. Each caliph represents a different soul pattern. There's Abu Bakr, he was known for his incredible faith, his trustworthiness. He represents the Al-Siddiq soul type. People like this are all about truth and righteousness.
Wow. So it's each caliph represents a different kind of archetype, I guess,
Yeah.
of spiritual excellence, something we can learn from and maybe even see in ourselves.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And then on top of that, we have Kolb typology. This adds another layer of understanding ourselves, and it uses those 12 HLALs that we talked about. Remember how those HLALs are all about the ways our hearts communicate, how we connect? Well, Kolb typology looks at how those HLALs show up and how we act, how they shape our experiences.
It's incredible how Nafsychology takes all these different things, the cognitive stuff, our soul inclinations, these heart languages, and weaves them together into this tapestry of the self.
It's really quite amazing. And the best part is it's not about putting anyone into a box.
Right.
It just gives us this framework to become more self-aware, to grow. It reminds us that we are not simple creatures. We have all these different dimensions.
This deep dive has been really amazing.
It has.
I mean, we've covered so much the core ideas of Nafsychology, those fascinating concepts like call metas and 12 HLLs, even how they approach personality types. It's definitely a lot to process, but in a really, really good way.
Absolutely. And don't forget, we're just scratching the surface here. There is so much more to explore within Nafsychology. So as you're learning about all this, here's something to think about. How could understanding your own Nafs, your Rue, your Kalb, those unique parts of yourself, how could that help you become more self-aware, grow as a person, and even have more fulfilling relationships? It's a journey worth taking, I promise.
I love that. And to all our listeners out there, we really encourage you to dive into the world of Nafsychology yourselves. You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and the people around you. Until next time, keep exploring.